One country that could play a key role in the future of Afghanistan is Qatar. The Gulf state has ties with both the Taliban and the United States, helping the US evacuate tens of thousands of people. The Taliban has reportedly asked Qatar for help managing Kabul airport after the US military withdrawal on Monday left it without air traffic control services. Well, you heard his name there. Journalist Bilal Sawari, who was forced to flee from Afghanistan to Qatar, joins us live now from Doha. Good to have you with us, Bilal. So, looking at the events of the past 24 hours, how does it feel to be watching what's happening in Afghanistan?
Actually, Abbasian made me very emotional. That rooftop where we had been reporting to the world, including my own lives for your own television station, is where a very large network of our friends would discuss the future of Afghanistan and how things unfolded in such a chaotic manner. I mean, you have to really look at Afghanistan under the Taliban now without a government, without any functional system in place. When you look at the cash crisis where the country is bankrupt and thousands of Afghans are waiting to get $200 per week, which is not enough for a family to buy even commodities and other necessary items, alone gives you an idea how big a challenge now for the Taliban it is to run the country. It might have been one thing to fight over the last 20 years, but it's another challenge to now make the transition and make Afghanistan functional, from banks to airports, to education, to health. And we know that the Taliban leader, Sheikh Haibatullah Akhundzada, has been holding meetings, according to Taliban sources, in Kandahar. He's not appeared in public so far, but it does look like the Taliban are under pressure. What type of a government they might be forming, how inclusive that might be, how much legitimacy, for example, it can attain, international funding, because the political office of Taliban understands the importance of both international legitimacy and international funding. They were exposed to the highest echelons of governments in Doha when they were negotiating with the Americans and everyone else. I would also like to, talk about the fighting that took place in Jabal Sarraj, outside of the city of Charikar in the province of Parwan, by fighters loyal to Ahmad Massoud, the son of Ahmad Shah Massoud, and fighters loyal to Amrullah Saleh, who was the former vice president. And the Taliban also face Islamic State as a brutal enemy, as a threat, So for the moment, economic hardships, uncertainty and fear prevailing, and the risk of bloodshed ahead, I think continues to haunt Afghanistan.
You started your career covering the US airstrikes against the Taliban in 2001. So having lived through that, looking back at that mission, would you rate it a success?
Absolutely not. What started in 2001 as a journey for peace, has ended up, being a very bloody, costly road for Afghans, for the Americans, for everyone else. And the end result was basically, very chaotic evacuation in the 11th hour, the attacks that we saw outside of the Hamid Karzai International Airport, the loss of Afghan lives, the loss of, for example, 13 U.S. service members, and then the drone strike, just outside of the airport inside the city of Kabul was unimaginable even until a year ago, which killed civilians. I think what we also are looking at is Afghanistan in 2001, when I came back to it, resembled more like a destroyed society. No infrastructure, no telecommunication, no education, not the younger, more capable generation that it has now, and quite tragically, there's been an exodus of that. So for the Taliban, they're also inheriting a different Afghanistan, perhaps an Afghanistan with problems, but an Afghanistan with changes as well. And how the Taliban can make, that transition, I think will be crucial. At the end of the day, 18 million Afghans face the risk of famine. There's been massive economic losses because the fighting over the years have really had a destructive impact on the economy, on the lives of farmers who've lost their pomegranates, their grapes, their figs, their cotton, their rice. So we will have to see how that, will work in terms of borders opening, and Afghanistan can hopefully soon start importing rice and wheat that Afghanistan has traditionally done always, despite being an agricultural country. And at the moment, just ordinary food prices are beyond the limits of ordinary Afghans. I remember as a kid during the 1990s when the Russians left at that time, and it was the former communist government, people were lining up literally in cold Kabul winters to get, fuel that was not available. People were lining up outside of bakeries. There was a severe shortage of, bread and wheat and flour when Kabul was under siege. And in many ways for Afghans, it is the repeat of the 1990s when you think about large crowds outside of the banks, the high prices of, food and other commodities.
Bilal Sawari, thanks very much indeed for talking to us today.
Well, the UN Security Council adopted a resolution on Monday calling on the Taliban to allow safe passage for those seeking to leave Afghanistan and demanding that Afghan territory not be used to threaten or attack any country or to shelter or train terrorists. 13 countries, including the United States, the UK and France, voted in favour of it, with China and Russia both abstaining. With more on this, our reporter Zhang Nini joins us from the London newsroom. So, Nini, tell us more about why China abstained from this Security Council resolution.
Hi, Paul. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Wang Wenbin said that China has doubts over the necessity and urgency of the resolution and has worked with Russia to offer revisions, but the opinions have not been taken into account. Take a listen.
China has always opposed to forcefully pushing for resolution by any sponsors when disagreements still exist among parties. Based on the above considerations, China has abstained from this draft resolution. Fundamental changes have taken place in the domestic situation in Afghanistan. Any action taken by the Security Council, including the timing, should help to ease the conflict instead of flare up tensions and facilitate a smooth transition rather than plunge the country back into chaos.
Wang Wenbin also reiterated that the chaotic situation in Afghanistan is largely due to the hasty pullout of the U.S. and allied troops, and the withdrawal is not the end of responsibility. He urges U.S. and other countries to respect Afghan sovereignty and territorial integrity.
The withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan shows that the policy of military intervention and imposing a country's values and social systems on another's is only doomed to failure. Afghanistan was able to free itself from foreign military occupation, and the Afghan people have ushered in a new starting point for peace and reconstruction. The country has turned a new page in its history. China respects the sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity of Afghanistan, and China remains committed to the non-interference in Afghanistan's internal affairs and pursues a friendly policy for all Afghan people.
Wang said that the U.S.-led Afghan war has led to the chaos and dire economic situation in Afghanistan. He said Washington should work with the international community to provide economic and humanitarian aid to Afghanistan, help the new regime run governmental functions normally, maintain social stability, and stop the currency from depreciating and the cost of living from rising. He added China will continue to support the Afghan peace reconstruction process. Back to you.
Zhang Nini, thank you very much.
Still ahead on this special edition of Global Business Europe. The last evacuation flights may have left Kabul, but those who got out before the deadline are still arriving in Europe.
Search CGTN Europe wherever you get your podcasts to subscribe to The Agenda podcast. The Agenda with me, Stephen Cole, always gets to the heart of the story. Just subscribe today and listen now.
Covering the world from 4 continents. A new horizon. Teams in Beijing, Washington, D.C., Nairobi, and London. Who connect, interact, and inquire to bring you the stories that matter to all. The Link. only on CGTN. Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities, reinvent, find new opportunities, discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
The world has changed under the pressure of the pandemic. For many of us, life is returning to some kind of normal. As we're adapting to changes in all of our lives, let Global Business Europe be your guide to the new normal. Join us weekdays on CGTN.
Welcome back. Just a reminder for you that CGTN is available to watch for free on all major digital platforms, on Smart TV and online on Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube and Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app. And in the UK, we're available 24 hours a day on Freeview.
Thousands of Afghan refugees are now in Spain before being found new homes across Europe.
For the past few weeks, the country's been acting as a hub to take in Afghans who've collaborated with EU institutions.
Rahul Pathak is live at the airbase in southern Madrid, where refugees have been arriving. So, Rahul, now all the Western troops have withdrawn from Afghanistan. Are any more evacuation flights expected there?
Not here at the Torrejon Air Force Base, Paul. But you're right in saying that the last official Spanish airlift out of Kabul officially ended on the 27th of August. That was last Friday. However, a flight from Kabul did land this morning at Spain's Rota naval base. Now, that's in Cadiz, which is around about 650 kilometres south of here. Now, that was carrying around 201 Afghan refugees or evacuees, and that was being operated by the United States military, so not Spain. And those evacuees will be temporarily housed at that naval base before being moved on to locations in the United States. Now, in terms of the evac operation organised by Spain, as I said, that officially ended last Friday. The Spanish Prime Minister speaking here at the Torrejon Air Force Base, Pedro Sanchez, he said that they would keep trying to extract Afghan allies, as he described them, in the months and the years ahead. Now, in terms of the current operation that ended on Friday, Spain says it managed to evacuate 2,206 people on a total of 17 flights, most of them Afghans who worked at the Spanish embassy, worked with Spanish forces, or for the various international agencies like NATO, United Nations, or with the United States forces. Paul?
Rahul, how's the dispersal of refugees going across the rest of Europe?
Well, most of the interest here in Spain, I've got to concentrate on Spain because that's what I've been focusing on, has actually been about the evacuation, getting them out of Kabul. And once they arrive in Spain, the interest tends to kind of fade. And I think, unfortunately, that attitude is being reflected in the actions or the relative inaction of the Spanish government. From what I can see, the government is looking to the various charities, the NGOs, to really take over the responsibility of looking after these people once they arrive here. I mean, we've been following the story of one Afghan family, the Kohestanis, which you might have seen our package over the weekend. Now, they've been given a place to live for a year in a place called Logroño, but they'll have to leave there after 1 year, and after that, they're pretty much on their own. They've been given just over $2 a day per person to live on, and and what's more, there's very little chance of them finding work here. Even though all of them are highly educated, they're all educated they've all had master's degrees. One is a Spanish translator, but there's very little chance of them finding work here. For the ones that don't speak Spanish, there's pretty much little to no chance of them finding work here. So ideally, They would like to be resettled in the UK. They have family in the UK. There's a huge Afghan community over there, but that obviously would mean Spain and the United Kingdom having to work much more closely together and cooperate much more closely together in terms of resettling these refugees. And Pedro Sanchez has called for European nations. Remember, he didn't say the EU, he said European nations, and that means the UK, I think, to present a united front in accommodating these refugees. But in terms of cooperating with the UK and Spain, I think that's something that's been sorely lacking up till now, and we'll have to see whether that changes in the future. I think that there's obviously a meeting going to be taking place in the next few days about how best to deal with this huge influx of Afghan refugees into Europe. Paul?
Rahul Pathak in Madrid, thank you.
So with the evacuation flights over, the UN Refugee Agency says a larger crisis is just beginning in Afghanistan for the millions of people left behind. Rula Amin is from the UNHCR. She says the needs of those who've been displaced are only growing.
Well, right now we have to remember that there are over 3.5 million Afghans who had to flee their homes looking for safety in the past few years, and they are still displaced inside their own country. Since the beginning of the year, more than 550,000 Afghans included in the 3.5 million who had to flee their homes. So these people are looking for safety. They need humanitarian assistance. They need shelter. They need support to get their basic needs, food, water, access to services. And these needs are only growing with this deepening crisis.
And which kind of groups are most vulnerable?
Well, you know, being displaced is a horrific experience, and it places on people a lot of pressure, and on parents and families, immense demand in order to be able to provide safety for their kids, for their families, to provide food and water, to provide a roof on top of their heads. And amongst them, many are women, many are children, and the elderly. We are trying to reach those who are in need, but there are many. So we're trying to reach the most vulnerable. And this is one of our main concerns, how to maintain our presence on the ground, to stay and deliver support to these people who need it most. And to be able to do so, we need commitment from the different parties and from the authorities. We need safe and unrestricted, unhindered access to all these people in order to be able to fulfill our commitment to stay. We also need the international community to keep its attention on Afghanistan, to continue with its commitment and increase its commitment to support humanitarian agencies like UNHCR, to enable us to stay on the ground and support these people at a very difficult moment.
So 3.5 million people displaced inside Afghanistan. And for those people who've actually fled the country, what kind of solutions can be found for them in the longer term?
Well, I need to clarify. There are those who have been evacuated in the past few weeks. And these have been evacuated without any intervention or role for UNHCR. It happened according to arrangements made by the US and its allies and some of the hosting countries. But we have to remember, Afghan refugees had been forced to cross borders and look for safety and asylum for the past 4 decades. In Afghanistan and Iran alone, we have 2.2 million Afghans who have been refugees now for decades. And these countries need support to be able to continue hosting these refugees.
Well, do stay with us on CGTN. Coming up, EU ministers discuss how Europe should react to the expected wave of refugees from Afghanistan.
The EU's digital COVID certificate, which offers the promise of unlocking hassle-free travel around Europe this summer.
In less than 2 weeks' time, the Czech border will also open to all EU and Serbian citizens. 4.4 million Hungarians received their first dose of COVID vaccine.
18 and over can receive a COVID-19 vaccination, but it does come with conditions.
Third wave will probably take longer to emerge. This vaccination centre is part of a massive effort to try and drive down the numbers of the new variant that was first identified in India.
On the agenda with me, Stephen Cole, we look up into space. We look down into data. We look at debt. We look at politics. We look at opioids, climate change. We look at all the issues that really matter around the world. But you matter too. We want to tell the stories you want to see and hear about. Make it your agenda.
We can try out the wild and crazy ideas.
Nothing can stop an idea whose time is coming. This idea is coming.
I actually feel quite comfortable in isolation.
We should all be very basic when we're trying to save the world.
Oh, no.
We hope it will happen. We have to live in hope.
The agreement is signed. But what is the real deal now the UK has left the EU? For trade, for business, for the city, for ordinary people. Make sense of Brexit with CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Paul Barber and Robin Dwyer. Our top story. A new era begins for Afghanistan as the last US forces leave. The Taliban takes over the airport and millions of Afghans wonder what the future holds.
In Washington, Republicans are calling for the US president's impeachment or resignation following the hasty withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan, accusing him of abandoning Americans.
Up to 200 citizens were unable to get on the remaining flights out of Kabul, with the last plane leaving the airport just before midnight local time, almost a day ahead of the 31st of August deadline. Well, our correspondent Caroline Malone joins us now from Washington. So, Caroline, President Biden's facing a lot of criticism over this, with some saying he broke his promise to evacuate all stranded US citizens from the country.
That's right. Well, Republicans and actually some Democrats as well have been criticising President Biden. Some people going as far as to call it a national disgrace that Americans were left behind. The House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, for instance, has said that the president will face a reckoning for his handling of the US exit. And there's just been a Republican presser in the last hour in which politicians have said that Biden allowed the reputation of the US government to be destroyed. So very strong words coming from the Republicans there. Well, other people have actually taken a different stance, though. They've been congratulating the diplomats, particularly in the US military, for managing to evacuate more than 120,000 people in these really challenging circumstances in the last few weeks. The US personnel, of course, as we know, are out of Kabul with those international flights halted. There are many people, of course, that did make it to the US, Afghans and Americans. And there are 9 agencies here who are working with the State Department in particular to help the newly arrived Afghan refugees. They've reportedly been told to expect as many as 50,000 Afghan refugees to arrive in the US. And that's an issue that's likely to be contentious here in the coming weeks and months too.
So we've had some strong words from the Republicans then, but President Biden himself due to address the situation within the next few hours. What are we expecting him to say?
That's right. President Biden is due to speak shortly, and he's likely to talk again about that decision not to prolong the US mission in Afghanistan beyond August 31st. Well, previously he said there's never a good time to pull out of Afghanistan, and keeping the US military there any longer just increases the risk of attacks, as of course we saw on Kabul airport last week. Well, Biden will likely reiterate again the hard work of the American military. Earlier in the week, he already thanked the US forces, saying they worked with unmatched courage, professionalism and resolve. He's also likely to start to look towards the future, and as the Afghan war is officially over now and a new diplomatic era is beginning, well, the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, has confirmed the US has moved its Afghan consular work from Kabul to Doha, Qatar. And that is where many of the Taliban talks actually happened over the last few years. And Blinken has also emphasised that for any US-Taliban partnership to work in the future, the group's going to have to govern in a very different way from the way it did in its brutal reign in the 90s. But many groups in the US want Biden to address the issue of human rights by the Taliban, to uphold the promises of the rights of women, for instance, and, of course, to ensure that those Americans left behind are given safe passage out.
Caroline Malone in Washington, thank you. Well, after the Taliban's return to power, worries are growing that Afghanistan could become a safe haven for terrorists. Dr. Hans-Jakob Schindler was the former coordinator of the ISIL, Al-Qaeda and Taliban monitoring team at the United Nations Security Council. I'm pleased to say he joins us now. Thanks very much indeed for being with us. So now that the US has withdrawn from the country, still a very unstable situation with no government in place, millions of people displaced. What's your assessment of the security situation now?
Good evening, and thank you so much for having me. The security situation is, of course, very fluid and very challenging. You have seen the attacks of ISIS-K on the airport, and just before the Americans left, there was another rocket attack on the airport. The ability of the Taliban to rein in terror groups has to be called into question. I mean, in the last 20 years, they've demonstrated an ample ability to perpetrate terrorism. Preventing terrorism is quite something else. And their symbiotic relationship with Al-Qaeda and its affiliates will make this very hard, because now the Taliban have good and bad terrorists in their country. Al-Qaeda and affiliates who have sworn personal loyalty to the Taliban, the leadership, are okay, apparently, while ISIS-K will then potentially serve as a recruitment hub for those Taliban who will not benefit from the new regime. And of course, as always, there's going to be winners and losers also within the Taliban when power gets distributed.
So how do you see the relationship between the Taliban and ISIS-K? Can there be one?
Well, I mean, so far it's fairly adversary, because they do belong to competing ideological trends within the wider global Islamist terrorist movement. I don't see that this is going to change very quickly. As I said, disgruntled Taliban had formed, or continue to form, the core of ISIS-K, and any Taliban who is at the moment not going to be benefiting from the new regime is very likely going to join that group, which will only increase its ability to conduct attacks both in Afghanistan but also within that region, and potentially also then in the long run again in Europe and the US.
So looking to the future and a Taliban government, what are its major challenges and can it meet them, do you think?
There are many challenges. I mean, first and foremost, there is an actual, really serious humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan going on. This country was on the verge of a humanitarian crisis before the Taliban took over. Now their takeover has made things immeasurably harder. First of all, there is no longer an operational international airport in the country. You can no longer fly to Afghanistan. Neither can humanitarian goods come into the country that easily. All has to be transported on the ground. Secondly, there's a security challenge, both terror groups as well as internal opposition that the Taliban have to deal with. So there is quite a lot of things that the Taliban have to sort out fairly quickly if they want to prevent chaos in the country.
So you've described the difficult security situation in Afghanistan. What impact will it have on the region and the wider world?
Well, violence in Afghanistan always has the uncomfortable habit to permeate out of the country, primarily, first of all, into neighboring countries. Pakistan is, of course, very much concerned that there are going to be spillover effects, but also because we have all of these Al-Qaeda affiliates operating in Afghanistan right now, there is a real possibility and risk that we will have a re-establishment of a terrorism infrastructure, maybe not camps, but connections and networks that will then facilitate, again, attacks outside the region as well.
And how challenging do you think it will be for world powers to build a diplomatic relationship with the Taliban, a group which just weeks ago there was no such thing in place?
Yes, this is going to be very, very challenging. And you've already seen last night or last afternoon in New York, the Security Council, there was the first mumbling of a breakdown of the, till now, quite strong consensus on what to do with the Taliban when Russia and China abstained from the latest Security Council resolution. So obviously their relationship with Al-Qaeda will remain a stumbling block, especially for Europe and North America, to re-establish any kind of actual diplomatic relationships apart from negotiations that are ongoing right now.
Hans-Jakob Schindler, great to get your thoughts today. Thank you.